Addiction is a crippling disease that affects millions of people around the world. How can a church provide support to individuals or families that suffer with addiction? Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Addiction.
Welcome to another episode of The Big E, the elephant in the room. My name is Melissa. Today we will be talking about addiction, how the church can help. A lot of times our church doesn't want to face these type of topics. Today we have four great guests. We have Andreas, we have Yvonne, we have Charlene, and we have Pamela. So thank you very much for being part of the Big E, the elephant in the room.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your background and your experience dealing with addiction and support for addiction.
Okay. You want to go first?
I
can go first. Yvonne Ward, and I have been working with individuals that struggle with some substance use and mental health for probably about 30 years now, working kind of from the bottom up and work with the indigent homeless population, helping people get connected to resources and just trying to help them find ways to find themselves and live their best lives. So it's been a long road and there's a lot more work to be done, but also a rewarding road as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for everything that you do.
Again, my name is Andreas Parsley. I began in substance misuse in 2005. Primarily began with adolescents and young adults, also translated over to adults later on in my career. So about 18 years in substance abuse. I'm CSAC for the state of North Carolina, also IC and RC certified, which allows me the reciprocity to work across the country as a substance abuse professional, excuse me.
Well, we thank you again for everything you do and the support you do for our community. So we're going to dive in and talk to Charlene and Pamela. So Charlene and Pamela, whoever would like to go first, tell us a little bit about your experience dealing with addiction.
My name is Pamela, and overall, my experience with addiction tied into alcohol and anxiety, those two areas. It stemmed from not only a family, my father's side, that had alcohol addiction and alcoholism in it, but also losing my parents at an early age and not really knowing how to handle that. And no one at that time, because of the generation, being able to assist. During my teenage years, because I lost my parents when I was 15, during my teenage years, I just wanted to be the model student and ensure that I graduated from high school, which my parents had certain promises that I had made to them when they passed. But in my traditional college years, which were in my early 20s, at NC State, that's when I started spiraling. If anything caused me anxiety or any kind of stress or whatever, I found my refuge in alcohol. And I'm not speaking of a beer, because I didn't even like beer. I'm talking about hard alcohol. And it wasn't like I'd get a little cup or a little drink. I'd have a half a G. And that's what comforted me. And that continued on for quite a while in my college years, and even outside of that until I hit almost 30. But that's, basically my experience with it, and anxiety tying into that. I did eventually get therapy, but the story of what happened to make me stop drinking actually tied into a one-on-one experience that I had, and people can say it's an out-of-body experience or whatever. I call it an experience with God for real. It was just he and I that assisted me in stopping the drinking altogether. I don't know how far you want me to go with that, but as we move through this series, this conversation, I'll share more of that.
No,
Thank you.
definitely. That's why we're on this platform, to bring awareness and to, you can be that vessel of support to someone else. So I'm just going to go into Charlene, if you can bring out to everyone your experience with addiction.
So my experience was a little different in that growing up, there was absolutely no issues with drugs or alcohol, and there was really no talks about it. In the church, it was light conversations, but it just wasn't my experience because everything around me was the church. So probably around 25 or 26. And also I just remember, so my addiction was with cocaine for about 5 years. And which is really kind of ongoing, if you know anything about addiction, which you guys do. So I just remember my father saying, cocaine, that's a white person's drug, black people can't afford that. So one particular evening, I was in Kansas. I was in the military. Well, I was out the military, but I dealt with a lot of military because my husband was in the military. And one of my friends, she had mentioned at the time, me and my husband were separated, and I was living with this little young boy drug dealer just to share rent. And my roommate, one of my friends, had mentioned, what does he sell? And so she mentioned about, cocaine, how her and her husband, they used to do it before they got in the army. And I was like, really? You did that? Black people don't do that. I mean, I was just like, so the curiosity just took over for me. So I started dipping and dabbing and experimenting, and I loved it. And it became more of a social thing. Ended up getting divorced, moving in with my parents, and my second husband, me and him, that's what we did. We was like a Bobby and Whitney type of thing. So our relationship was basically based off of getting high all the time. And fortunately for me, I lived with my parents. So I also had a husband who was there to kind of look out for me, if you will. So I wasn't just out there. But I always felt like, as the urge, as it increased, and we're doing this, hanging out 3, 4, 5 times a week, going 2 and 3 days, like, it just slowly spiraled out of control until it's, never to the point of stealing and or missing work or anything like that. I was functional. I always wanted to make sure my hair was done and I looked decent because I didn't want to fall in that category of crackhead or, and just cocaine. My husband he graduated to crack. And I'm like, why can't you tell me we're all doing drugs? What's the difference? But I just felt like, well, I don't have a control over this cocaine thing, so I'm definitely not going to try that. And I just wanted more for myself. But at the end of the day, and I'll tell anybody, I love cocaine. I mean, when I experienced it, the euphoria, the talking, the people around, the social, for me, it was just, I couldn't do anything I didn't want to do anything without it. I didn't want to go for a walk. I didn't want to enjoy the sunshine. I didn't want to go to the beach. Like, even if we went to the park, it was, wish we had some cocaine. So that was my experience. Started driving trucks, got away from it. And I don't want to say I never looked back, but it has never been the same, because for me, the come down was very depressing. And then when you are going through having anxiety and having issues with depression, of course, that doesn't help. And that's the one thing to make you feel better. Also, the longer you go without the thing that you're trying to get away from, no different than food, that's the one thing you want to reward yourself with. So that was my experience, and we can get into more, like, I'm sorry, what's your name, Pamela?
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, like she said, we can get into other things as we go deeper into this conversation. But in general, that was my experience on, what I dealt with.
Well, I thank you, Pamela, as well as Charlene, to be transparent about your journey and your story, because it's not easy sometimes to look back at what transpired. But I thank you for that, because you, believe it or not, are helping someone currently right now as we are talking about this. So I just want to ask more on the licensed professional side. What can cause someone to have an addiction? Yes, Charlene, as well as Pamela said, due to anxiety. What are some of the other signs of someone that can possibly have become addicted to various? And then I'm just going to also dive in before you answer your question. Alcohol and drugs are not always one of the main, those are the main, they say, of addiction, but you have food addiction, you have sex addiction, shopping addiction, you have a lot of it. So we're going to be talking about just addiction.
I think we talk about anxiety and depression, but she also mentioned grief, grief, the loss of her parents. And, Charlene mentioned social. It was a social thing. So trying to fit in or, be a part of initially. I think there are lots of different reasons people have difficulty regulating their emotions or being connected to people, family, friends, just making friends. And so sometimes it can give you a false sense of just comfort or a false sense of being able to kind of fit in. And so it can be as simple as that.
There are multiple models that are always presented as it relates to substance misuse, abuse. But the three most common models that we deal with are the disease model, of course, which says that there is a chemical imbalance and there is a genetic or historical connection to the addiction. Then there's the moral model, which we often look at from the church's perspective, where there is some kind of mental or emotional weakness in a person that causes them to be drawn to in things of sin, particularly in addiction. And then there's the mental health or the psychopathological model, which suggests that there's a mental health disturbance or some form of trauma, cognitive difficulties that push individuals towards addiction. And so generally, we're dealing with one of those three models when we are dealing with addiction. And I believe the ladies have kind of discussed all three in their own specific instances here on this particular broadcast.
Well, we thank you so far for this wonderful conversation that we're having, but we have to take a commercial break and we'll be right back.
We know that God has called you to a mission, but sometimes you need a little help getting there. At the Center for Clergy and Church Support, we strive to encourage, empower, and equip ministries and nonprofit organizations to do all that God has called them to do. We handle basic legal issues, conduct administrative and financial audits, and strengthen organizations in community engagement and capacity building. Let us help your ministry or nonprofit in advancing the kingdom of God. Visit clergycenter.org for more information.
What can the family do to provide support to their loved one that was formerly having addiction or is currently have addiction?
Understanding that there's a difference in every portion of it. So for some people, they are misusers, right? And they are occasional individuals who drink too much, get drunk every now and again, or get too high every now and again. Then there are the abusers. The abusers are individuals who are just using it consistently and are damaging themselves. And then there are those individuals who are dependent. And that's a whole other matter. You know what I mean? The individuals that are dependent are individuals who actually have gotten to the place where they actually need the drug in order to operate in a functional fashion. You know what I'm saying? So the first thing is that we have to be educated on what's transpiring. You know what I mean? And if we're educated on what's transpiring and in which phase a person is in, then we can deal with that person where they are and at their specific need. A person who is a misuser definitely doesn't need the same level of care and the same type of care as a person who is dependent. You know what I mean? And then we have to understand that different types of drugs create different types of issues for individuals. So a person who has been struggling with alcohol for years and is now dependent on it, honestly, should not just quit cold turkey, because quitting alcohol cold turkey after being dependent can kill that person. Because they have become biologically dependent upon it. And so they need to be weaned off and transition from it. Whereas an individual who may be experiencing opiate addiction, you can actually cause that person to quit cold turkey. In addition to that, they may not feel good, but it won't kill them. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there's different levels to the different drugs, as well as there's different levels to each individual type of addiction or stage of addiction that a person is in.
Do you have
some? I think for me, when we talk about families, it's important to, of course, education is going to be very important, but to help people understand that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I think I'll go use drugs and lose my job and lose my housing, lose my friends, and, you know, just hang out in the street and, you know, not really have any connection to anybody. It typically is something that has, I think, like Andrea said, kind of drawn them to, but to be supportive, but not to be an enabler. Don't be an enabler who helps the individual. Be honest, but also be there. I think what happens is a lot of times we really hurt our families and friends when we are in our active addiction and we do things that we probably typically wouldn't do. And so therefore families kind of, go away. But it's really important to kind of continue to support those individuals. And that might just be a phone call. How you doing? I know things are not well. You might not be able to come to my house. I know you're going to pick up everything and take it out the door. However, I still want you to know I'm here for you and that I care for you. And let me know how I can be supportive. How can I get you some help? Here's some resources. So I think it's important for families to be supportive. And that's hard for families when they watch their family members struggle. It's really hard for them because they don't understand.
So that's what I was going to just address. What are the best steps to talk to someone that has suffered? So you kind of already addressed that. So Pamela and Charlene, what do you think over the years that you saw that could have happened better for you in providing that support to your, dealing with the anxiety and the addiction? What do you think that someone could have done better for you? And this can also help a viewer that is watching as well.
I'm going to say for me, because I was passed through my family after my parents passed, because they, like I said, they passed when I was 15, 6 months apart. And when I started actually dealing with my grief, my anger and all of that, I felt totally alone. Even though I was surrounded by people constantly because I was at college. But it was like, these people weren't my family. These were, like Charlene mentioned, these were just new people. What? Anyhow, but my family, I believe now that I'm older, I think they did the best that they could do with what they had. But at that time, it was like, I just wanted someone to listen to me. I wanted someone to care about me. It felt like they cared about everything that I could give them, i.e. the checks, i.e., because my dad was retired military. So I did get a military check. I did get, at that time, before Ronald Reagan took it out, as I'm aging myself or whatever, I did get a Social Security check until a certain age. And I did get other types of checks. And it seemed like that the people wanted that money. So I was like, but what about me? I lost my parents. Can somebody be there for me to talk to about this? Not that I wanted to be a victim. That was my big thing. I don't want to be a victim. And for me, I felt like I was empowered by drinking alcohol because I hid it in my mind from everybody. I go to class, I could be totally lit with alcohol. My favorite at the time was E&J. I could go to class, I'd do my classwork, go back to my dorm, chill out, had some people come over, we're drinking, because at the time that was the big thing for us, was drinking. And it was by me going to a predominantly, it was not at HBCU, a predominantly white school. That's what they did. So it was real easy to get alcohol. And we didn't have this 21-year-old age limit. We were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, because I started going into my pit at 24. Rock bottom happened prior to me going into 25. And when I say rock bottom, that means I started losing a lot of stuff. I had 2 cars repossessed because I was taking my money. I wasn't paying bills that I had acquired. I was just taking my money and just having a good time and drinking. And I mean, I could drink. It was like, for me, it was a prideful thing to know that I could drink certain people in a fraternity under the table and still be, in my mind, what I call functional, which wasn't functional at all as I look back on it.
Tolerance, high tolerance, right?
Yeah, exactly. In my mind, I'm like, oh, I'm all that. It was like bragging rights. And looking back on it, it was more so a dark time because I didn't know how to deal with the fact that you don't have a mama. And when people would say, oh, my mom's coming down, they're sending me stuff, I would really just kind of withdraw. And I would really go into a moment. And you can call it depression, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but for me, it was a dark place. Finally, a teacher recognized it and got me tied into the therapist on campus. His name was Dr. Woods, I believe. But anyhow, that gentleman changed my life. He really changed my life. He came to me and talked to me about my foundational structure, which of course is Christian and being raised in the church. Not once did anyone from my church who knew me approach me about anything after I left from my hometown to go to school. But they wouldn't have known because I always hid it from them because to them, I was Minnie and Ware's daughter, the good girl, who would never do anything wrong. So I had to hold down the fort for that, because for me, that was my parents' legacy. I didn't want to embarrass or put anything negative on my parents. But in all actuality, I was dying inside. And I did start finding that out and discovering that by going to Dr. Woods.
Wow. Well, thank you for that transparency again. And I'm going to keep saying transparency because this is true transparency and where you have come from and where you are now. And to know you personally, Pamela, all I can say is God is good. God is good. So Charlene, you were going to bring some emphasis to what Pamela was saying on your side of the support that you felt that you could have probably had better, or did you have good support?
You mean far as, I want to say no. During the years of the cocaine addiction, I told my mother because I had an uncle getting some. He told my aunt told my mother is saying, you a liar because of your kids and you want my daughter, yada, yada, yada. So I had to tell my mother because I didn't want that to come in between them two because nobody knew me to be on. Because now I'm back in New York because I was in Kansas, I was in Virginia, now I'm up in New York. And I had to tell my mother this, what was going on, so she wouldn't have to beef with her sister. So she didn't do anything. I didn't get any support. She didn't tell my father. She told my sister. My sister didn't do anything. Basically, if I was out hanging out, they would just call me, when you coming home? And when I would come, me and my husband would come in high after we ran out of money, didn't have nowhere else to go, then it would be like, you ugly. That's it. Okay. Me deciding to get away from the whole situation, I sent my daughter to go live with her father. I drove away from the whole situation as far as that goes. So even to this day, if I'm around my family and you know how family could kind of not bring out the best in you, I found out that they will be like, she must be high. So I tell my mother finally, I'm just like, and I can't believe this, because I'm past this. This is not something I'm doing anymore. And because I get emotional, I get accused of she must be high. So my sister tells me this, and I finally tell my mother, I said, what you need to understand about me is when I'm happy, when I'm having a good time and I'm laughing and getting along with the family, I am high. I'm high. I'm high. When I'm angry and I'm feeling everything, that's when you see the anger come out because I'm having to feel and forced to deal with everything and I'm not responding correctly. That's how that works for me. So no, I'm not high just because I just had an argument with my father. No, I'm not high because I just spoke some truth that nobody wants to hear, you know. So all these years later, I'm still being pegged as this person and that's hurtful. And I'm like, don't even talk to me because y'all didn't do nothing.
Where do you think the church can do better to provide the support? Listening to these stories with Pamela and Charlene, what do you think the church can do better?
I'll give 2 seconds and then you go, Andres. I just think that the church can be open and receptive. I think they need to allow and be partners with individuals who, you know, have some history and experience with working with individuals with addiction, and be open to being educated about how to be helpful and how to, you know, look at people as individuals and not as individuals, not as addicts.
I definitely believe that we have to move away from looking at it from the moral model of addiction as a weakness or a mental fragility. We have to go to understanding it from the disease model. This is a person that just is just as sick as an individual with diabetes, or a person with HIV, or a person with high blood pressure. And we have to embrace those individuals with the same kind of kindness that Christ embraced each person that he dealt with. Jesus wasn't the kind of individual who attacked individuals who were in horrible positions. He attacked people who were in leadership positions who didn't handle things for those who were in weak positions. The scriptures tell us explicitly that the strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak. And so our duty as believers and as the church is to put ourselves in position to, first of all, be educated on how addiction transpires through trauma, through family history, through social concepts and constructs that have damaged individuals and caused them to have to turn to those things. But then as we are educated on those things, we also have to understand the spiritual component. And the spiritual component is, it's built around this. I don't believe in generational curses as they've been traditionally taught. Generational curses only come from God. And what we've done in the church is we've made generational curses come from people and from the devil. But I do believe that there are specific spirits that will follow a particular family or attack a particular set of individuals who have specific weaknesses. The Bible says we are drawn away of our own lusts. And what a spirit will do is it will attempt to influence the weakness and the pain and the struggle and the frustration and the trauma of an individual and turn that individual to something that they will have to depend on to live rather than God. Every form of sin to me goes back to idolatry. And when an individual comes into a position where they are struggling with addiction, that thing becomes their God. The one lady here, Miss Charlene, has kind of described it, that the addiction had become her God. And so what we have to do is we have to introduce them to a God that is truly a savior from all things, and reach them where they are and at their specific need. If it's dealing with their trauma, we have to deal with their trauma. If it's dealing with their grief, we have to deal with their grief. If there are social constructs that they've struggled with, we have to introduce them to social constructs through our teaching. And that's where I believe the church has failed in some respects. But then there are guys like me. I'm a pastor. I'm an evangelist. I've traveled the world preaching. And so I've integrated substance abuse counseling into what we do in our services, as well as in our proclivities to the community. And that's what's necessary, I believe, in order to really have a functional effect on addiction.
My father was a former substance abuse counselor for 31 years. And he was all about truly making a difference and providing the support and services. And one thing he always said is we lack the support in our church. And everything that you just said, if we just start from how you have transformed in your church, start it in your church, I think we can go a long way to provide the help that our community as well as our church members need. So we want to thank everyone. We want to thank our guests for being part of this great episode. The Big E truly is all about making change, real change, and it starts here. So thank you again for being part of the Big E, the elephant in the room, where we speak about the unspeakable.